Okay, hello and welcome to the Enterprise Excellence Network webinar series. Today we are kindly joined by Chris Butterworth and Kevin Eyre. Today Chris and Kevin will be discussing why and how to assess your continuous improvement culture. So based on their recent book, Why Bother? So just a bit about us, the Enterprise Excellence Network. We're a members-only arena for senior lean leaders, founded by Peter Hines, based in Europe, and we host workshops with best practice host sites around common challenges within lean leadership. But if you'd like to find out more, you will receive an email with my details on after this webinar. So today we'll have a 30-minute presentation by Chris and Kevin, and then a 30-minute Q&A session at the end. So feel free, please, to ask your questions in the questions tab, which you should see in your control panel. Okay, so I'll just hand over to Peter Hines now. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks very much, Emma, and hello to everyone in the broadcast. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the Why Bother book, which will be coming out in, Chris will tell us, but a couple of weeks' time, something like that. And one of the chapters in that has been authored by Kevin, who's going to sort of deep dive into that section. So both Chris and Kevin and I have worked together for I don't know, 15, 20, 25 years, depends on which one of them, etc. But for quite a long time. So I'm just going to briefly introduce Chris, and then he'll pass over to Kevin. So Chris and I started working together in the late 1990s in some research we were doing in Cardiff University, and since that time we've done a lot of work together, published the Essence of Excellence book together. And really, Chris has been the lead author on this new book, which perhaps you'll say a few words about before we pass on to the chapter from Kevin. So, Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Peter. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. And that's just a high-level slide showing really the background to myself and some of the previous publications. I, for years, struggled to write a book, and then I was kindly introduced by a friend of mine into a process to follow. And in the last 4 years, this is now my fourth. So it's been a real journey of discovery. Next slide, Kevin. So the new book, Why Bother, might seem a strange title, but it's a phrase we come across a lot when we talk to organizations about doing assessments. And, so we thought, well, why bother doing this assessment? Because generally, assessments are seen as a bit of a pain, that there's something that people have to do. And usually, they're seen as an audit that don't really add any value. Whereas actually, we think if they're done properly and structured in the right way, a behavioral assessment is key to long-term sustainability for a number of reasons, because they provide a structured measurement of progress through the different maturity levels. They identify best practice opportunities that can be shared, and they identify opportunities for improvement. So what we've tried to do with the book is give an in-depth guide to why they're important and how to build them, and how to measure maturity through the different stages of a sustainable CI journey. We've done that with lots of practical tips on how to create it, and also included a whole range of case studies from organizations across the world, and also an in-depth case study on key behavioral indicators. So like the previous books, all the proceeds are going to charity, and in this case, all the proceeds are going to the Black Dog Institute, which is a mental health charity. So the book is available on Amazon. It's on Amazon already. It's a pre-order. Its stocks will come in on the 24th of October. I have just received a discount code, so if anyone wants a 20% discount on the book, just email Emma and I'll make sure you get that code. And what we're going to focus on this afternoon is Kevin has kindly contributed a chapter on the book which discusses how language and conversations need to change as you go through the different maturity levels. An area that's often underlooked, but critical to help achieve that maturity. So Kevin and I have worked together for a long time on various projects, and he's got a fascinating chapter in the book, and we're looking forward to this afternoon's conversation. So Kevin, over to you.
Okay, so I think in order, thank you, Emma, Peter, and Chris for all of those explanations and introductions. And Chris in particular, thank you for inviting me to this session along with Peter, and for allowing me to contribute to the book. I'm really delighted that this chapter has been taken up, as you say, in an area which is probably not so familiar to people who use maturity assessments. So where I would like to start, I think, is a little bit about talk, a brief word on talk. Then we'll do a little bit of a deep dive, come thrust into the nature of the chapter, and then a sort of provocation or a question to leave you with at the end of the session. So a brief word on talk, first of all, and Chris will know that I could take a day on this, so it's been very hard to boil this down to a few slides. But talk is sort of unrepresented, as it were, when we come to think about human behaviour. And I think this is a consequence just of the way that academic interest in what people do and how people interact with each other has gone. Talk, language, is a little bit on the periphery in some way, and yet it is absolutely central to human endeavour, human interaction, and culture, and the development of culture and society. Now, we talk all the time, and sometimes our talk can be fast and spontaneous, as depicted in this film snap here, 12 Angry Men, and sometimes it can be slow and thoughtful, as pictured through a snap from Annie Hall, and all sorts of other possibilities in between. We are the only species on the planet that has this extraordinary, exquisite ability to explain ourselves in minuscule detail. And it's what enables us to function in the way that we do, for good and for ill. Now, there's a lot of talk about non-verbal behavior. I think people who work in management, who have experienced development programs, often get really centered on the non-verbal thing. And I think it's possibly the wrong target. There's a place for non-verbal behavior in two dimensions, in our gestures and in the sounds that we make. And what the science says is that the brain, when we come to interact with people, picks up on three things in this sequence. Firstly, it picks up on gesture. What do I see in the face that confronts me? Am I looking at somebody who seems happy and prepared to talk to me? Am I looking at somebody whose face seems to say to me, stay away, don't come near me? The second thing we do is we hear the sound that people make when they speak, and we make interpretations of that sound. This is quite a primal response. Is this person angry, and should I avoid them? Does this person seem very eager to speak to me, and I'm inclined to go and address them, feeling safe about the nature of the interaction? Now, the words, interestingly, come third. But the problem is this: without the words, we really don't know what it is that's making somebody look or sound angry, or look and sound happy. It's the words that provide us with the detail and the clarity on what is going on for that person. And without the words, we're left with a guessing game. And the words themselves can have quite specific impact. So a couple of models to share before we get to the guts of the chapter, although arguably, without these, the chapter is not possible. So the first thing is our core sound wave model. What essentially we have done is to say, well, let's provide an analytical framework in which we can make sense of how people are talking. And the model is really simple. It's clustered around three main styles of asking, telling, and suggesting. We all ask, we all tell, and we all suggest. But what our research tells us is that some people have a tendency or preference to one or more of these things more than others. Some people like to ask a lot, some people like to tell a lot. And you think, okay, maybe this is important, maybe it's not. Well, we think it's really important. Inside each of the clusters, in turn, are three voices. So inquiring, probing, and diagnosing are 3 ways of asking. Critiquing, correcting, and challenging are 3 ways of telling. And articulating, advising, and advocating are 3 ways of suggesting. Now, we don't have time in this session to get into the minutiae of the meaning and the implications of all of this. So there are, I think, 3 things I want to make about, 3 points I want to make about the 9 voices. The first one is they all sound different. Somebody inquiring will sound different from the way in which they are articulating, and we are quite good at picking up on those subtleties. Secondly, they each have different intentions. The purpose behind inquiry is often very different to the purpose behind articulation or to correct. And thirdly, and perhaps this is the most important thing, they all have different effects. They all make people think or feel differently. Now, the way in which people think and feel is massive. And what we've constructed here is a little model, which we call the sound wave impact model, which in summary says people can have bad reactions to interaction and to talk. They can have a reaction that makes them tense or bored or defensive or overwhelmed, or they can have constructive and positive reactions to conversation and interaction. And people might be alert, reflective, connected, or relaxed. So one dimension of this model is about energetic arousal. The other is a bipolar frame that talks about a thinking impact or a feeling impact. And our assertion in Soundwave, if I jump back, is that different voices affect different states of mind and states of being in different yet in predictable ways. I'll give you one simple point of predictability. If you ever listen to the broadcaster David Attenborough, you will very quickly be drawn into the beauty of his articulation and will readily start to feel content, if not relaxed, listening to the voiceover on the films in front of you. 99 people out of 100 are likely to react in a similar way. However, if somebody is talking at me and they're going on and on and on, and they're shifting in our voices terms from being articulate to being verbose, I'm likely to feel somewhat overwhelmed by what is going on. Okay, so that's a little frame around predictability. In the book, so these models feature in the book, but the main thrust of the argument in the book is that if we think about stages of maturity, then there are some common models for looking at them. This is perhaps the most common, and variations on the theme. Organizations move from phases of pre-improvement through change and initiation, through to conformance or standardization, and to continuous improvement. And when we think about this journey over time, we are quite good at analyzing where we are by bringing an analysis of process or technique to the phases, and that analysis of process and technique sort of tells us where we are. What we've started to do is to ask ourselves, well, what is it people hear? What are people saying? What are the conversations that people are having? And there's an interesting pattern that emerges. Now, the sort of words you see on the screen here are more detailed in the chapter itself. We've generated the data from workshops with managers, something over 500 now. And what's interesting about this exercise that we conduct is just how common the responses seem to be. There is very little variation in people's response to both what they see, but importantly, what they hear. And just give a very, very simple example. Pre-improvement phases, which are characterized by high variation and often variable performance, are complaining, noisy, and stressful. This is what people will report hearing. At a lower level, inside the conversations, they will talk about people's propensity to criticize, possibly attack, to blame, to punish, and to preach. Nobody likes that situation, but it's one which seems to be common to an environment which may be post-entrepreneurial phase of development, for example. At the other end of the spectrum, we get a very, very different picture. Actually, this is an environment we listen to the place, the sound of the site is humming and buzzing. And what we're hearing is a much more inquiring environment. People asking questions of each other, people probing to understand better, people diagnosing to work through solutions, and people challenging each other in a constructive way, in the sense of how do we make what we're doing better. There are clearly phases in between. I won't elaborate those now in this webinar. But the challenge perhaps is, and the question to pose is, how could it be if we could accelerate improvement, not by following this path in a linear fashion, but by starting at the end point? What would happen if we started to inquire, probe, diagnose, and challenge in order to change the nature of the conversation and drive a different type of relationship? Could that speed up the rate at which our transformation takes place? Could it enable us to experience more fully and more quickly the type of continuous improvement environment everybody wants to get to, but not everybody manages to reach? Now, outside of our work on Soundwave, and I'll come back to that in a while, there's a lovely piece of work by an academic in California called Shelly Gable. And Shelly Gable works with individuals in relationships, and she has this very, very simple and very practical model which runs through 4 different types of conversation, from active constructive on the right hand side through passive constructive, going backwards, passive destructive, and active destructive. And she sort of gives an example of a response for each of those styles in relation to somebody's statement, hey, I just got a promotion. So an active constructive response is one that combines inquiry, enthusiasm, and support. Hey, I just got a promotion. That's great. What will you be doing? When do you start? Tell me, why did they choose you? And this contrasts massively with the picture at the active destructive end, which is, you know, there's no extra pay and it'll eat up a lot of your spare time. Now, you might not be surprised for me to now tell you that a lot of Gable's work is focused on relationships, and particularly partner relationships. And so this is a little exercise that you are, of course, free to try at home. But the point of her work is that what she notices is that when partners who might be in disagreement with each other shift the nature of their conversation out of active or passive destructive into what she terms active constructive, then very, very quickly the relationship starts to show signs of improvement. So we're offering this here in the context of the chapter and the work of Soundwave to say we're not the only people who take a view that changing the nature of the conversation changes the relationship and changes outcomes. In our slide deck, we've got a little blank sheet here, which, as I say, you can use at home, and you can insert any comment you like. And for those of you who might have teenage daughters, you know, Dad, I'd like to stay at Dave's tonight, might be a good one for you to think about in terms of how you respond actively, constructively. If we come back to the main theme of this maturity assessment and the sounds we hear and the voices that are using, if we are to pick up my challenge of earlier and move faster to stage 4 by pulling on the character of the conversation of stage 4, we need to know something about what type of conversation works for each stage. And that really is the focus of the chapter, and we'll outline some of this for you here. So we're back to some of the models that we shared earlier, and what you'll see here is top left, here is our pre-improvement stage of high variability and probably high performance. And what you'll notice on the right are the voices which typify that type of environment. And so the voices which ordinarily might be constructive in their use have become accentuated in this environment. Critique becomes criticize, correct becomes punish, and so on and so forth. And what I might also have added here is that these asking voices of inquire, probe, and diagnose are noticeable largely by their absence. And the interesting question here is what's causing what? Does the variation and the chaos that ensue does that drive the conversation, or does the conversation actually play a role in driving a continuation of the high variability? Because someone who's punished and attacked and preached at is not going to be offering very much in the way of discretionary effort to improve things. And you'll see that in the impact model below, where generally speaking, what will happen if I am on the receiving end of those type of voices and the conversations I'm having is a broadly negative effect. Negative states of mind, negative states of being will predominate my feelings. And that, as to repeat myself, is going to have an effect on the level of discretionary effort somebody offers and the performance that they're able to give. So the first thing we have to do here is, if we're in that situation and we're voicing ourselves in this way, is stop it. Cut out the criticism, cut out the punishment, cut out the attack. Now, hopefully somebody picks up the cudgel and says, this isn't good enough. We need to change this. And we move it to through a phase of change and initiation. And here the balance of the voices starts to shift. Our view in Soundwave is that we all need all 9 of the voices. We all need to be skillful at them. But some situations demand greater emphasis on some voices than others. And so here we can see that what's really critical at this stage is strong use of the 3 suggestive voices. Here we're in a phase where we're trying to persuade and educate people to move to something different. The articulate, advise and advocate are underlined, as you can see. The little dotted line is under inquiry and diagnose, is suggesting we need a bit more of that coming through as well. But at this stage, we wouldn't overwhelm people with questions. We'd be providing some sort of gentle, directional, but firm leadership. The voices that would be less absent, because they're more characteristic of the phase we've just come from, are the telling voices. And you begin to see a change in impact. There will be a legacy of negative emotional states continuing, but there will start to be the emergence of more positive states. People alert, excited, reflective about what might be happening to the organization and to them, and a level of connection. And as that first phase goes wonderfully well, and we start to standardize our processes and provide leader standard work and so on and so forth, we see another shift, and a really interesting shift in the way in which we use our voice. A combination at this point of asking and telling. In particular, the use of the correctional voice in relation to standards defined, invested in and achieved. If this is how the work ought to be done for optimal effect, then this is how the work is done. Obviously, as a platform for continuous improvement, it's never static, but at this point in time, this is how it's done. So we are interacting with people in a way that use voices that both seek to understand why deviation might have occurred and offer direction on how deviation should be corrected. And this is an interesting balance between some dimensions of the asking and the telling voices. And the effect you can start to see below. Most of the negative states start to disappear from the picture, and the range of positive states starts to broaden. So actually what this starts to bring about is a level of contentment in the way that work is done, a level of peacefulness in the environment. And certainly when we talk to our 500 plus managers and we get their views on what this phase is like, they start to talk about it being quieter, a stiller, a more peaceful environment, an environment where people start to focus on the things that they can do. And then finally, we move to the utopia of continuous improvement. And again, a point about the research data we've collected. Most of the organizations we've worked in over time are at relatively earlier stages of maturity. So their felt experience of what it is to be in this phase is relatively limited. And so they're relying much more on their imagination to give us some sense of what this might be like. Nonetheless, what tends to come through, and I think is corroborated from other sources, is all voices being important, but a shift towards asking. We know it's the asking of other people in terms of what they think about what the problems are and how they think problems that should be addressed, that both drives ownership and a level of connectedness between the people and the organization. So big emphasis on probing, diagnosing, and inquiring, and particularly inquiring. Sometimes we talk about inquiry-led leadership as being characteristic of this phase. And if this works well, then although this is a slightly artificial description, we shouldn't see so much of those negative states. We should see much more of the more positive states. Now, the important thing about this is that leaders can learn how to use these voices in more skillful ways. And the chapter in question gives you not all of the answers, but it gives you some tips. It gives you some tips on what voices are critical and particularly what has to be done to transition from one stage to the other through the appropriate use of conversation. And whilst that can be done, whilst leaders can learn to do that at a macro level, at the level of trying to decide how culture is shaped, leaders can also work to design conversations in more structured settings. So what we have on the screen here is a little depiction on the left-hand side of somebody's assessment of the proportionate use of these voices in a tiered meeting as a current state scenario. And on the right-hand side, given the outcomes that are desired from the tiered board meeting, what the proportion of emphasis should be on those particular voices. And this comes from a piece of work that designed the process thinking about conversation as much as thinking about agenda, role, and responsibility. And the shift from the other one to the other was trained in and orchestrated. And delightfully, the leaders of organizations can sometimes lead to impressive results. So my penultimate slide, not my final slide, my penultimate slide is this. And it plays directly to Chris's question, why bother? And the answer, why bother listening to the sound of your workplace, is because you are sitting on freely available, untapped, massive amount of information and data about how your people feel about each other and relate to each other. And even if it's at the level of dropping in to organizational meetings and asking yourself the question, what am I hearing here? Am I hearing people ask, tell, or suggest? You start to tune in to the nature of conversation and people's reaction to their felt responses to that conversation. So my invitation is twofold. It's to read the chapter and get a deeper insight into things I've spent a few minutes talking about here this afternoon, but also take a little bit of a risk, drop into your organization and listen out for that free, untapped, available data on how conversations are constructed in your organization. And ask yourself, if I listen to this conversation, what is it telling me about the maturity of my organization? Now, my final slide, therefore, is this. I've given you a brief run through on chapter 6. Chapter 6 is, with its focus on why bother focusing on the type of conversations people have, is simply one of 10 chapters. I'm delighted that I've contributed a chapter here, but there are 9 other chapters that it will be worth looking at once you acquire a copy of the book, Why Bother? That, I think, is as much as I would like to say about my chapter. Chris, if I just pass back to you, maybe you could just pick up on questions we might want to process from our participants this afternoon.
Great, thank you, Kevin. That was an excellent summary, very, very insightful. And one of the reasons we asked Kevin to contribute was we feel this is an area that is just overlooked. Many assessments focus purely on maturity of tools. We firmly believe that that only gets you so far. You really need to start basing our assessments on the maturity of behaviours, and a key element of those behaviours is the types of conversations that people have. And if we build those into the way we assess CI maturity, then we'll get much more sustainable results. And with the provocation Kevin made, the potential to actually move faster in embedding a culture of continuous improvement if we can really change the conversations that people have. So we're both open to any questions people might have. I think Peter's going to come join us again and facilitate those conversations as he gets the question.
Yep, I'm coming back. Okay, thank you very much, guys, for that, and Kevin in particular. So obviously, we've only touched on one chapter in detail in the book, but maybe we can take any questions from the audience. If you want to write into the question tab, then I can pose those questions. Perhaps while you're having a think and writing things down, I've got one or two things that I could pose. So Kevin, the sort of main thrust of what you were talking about was sort of what the leader might do with their team. I'm sort of assuming that this is not just a top-down thing, that this is also a peer-to-peer thing, and even a peer-to-boss type conversations as well.
I think that's right, Peter. I think that if I bridge back to what Chris was saying a moment ago, this is a way of looking at organizations which is not so common and somewhat neglected for a whole series of reasons. But language and conversation is at the center of organizational life, and what the models, the sound wave models, are doing are allowing anybody anywhere within the organization to start to tune into what is happening between people. So you and I may be part of a management team, we're peers in the organization, and before I read the chapter in Chris's book, I knew there was something you did that annoyed me, but I didn't know what it was. And actually now I can pin it down. Now I can say, you know what, Peter, I really like the explanations that you give to me. They're enormously helpful. I would really welcome being a bit crisper. There's some language to describe this. I want articulation. I don't want verbosity. Okay, and so that's a really, really simple explanation of what one could do. But it's also the case that some client organizations take this model and framework and they deploy it down through the organization. So actually, there's a language for the language. People can start to tune and say, well, we're meant to be driving connection in the workforce. We're meant to be pushing ownership, and we know that if we ask people good questions, that will drive ownership. But I've sat in this meeting for the last hour and I've heard 2 questions. So the gap between what we're intending to do and which we really want to do and what's actually happening is massive. And unless we address that, we're not going to make the progress that we want to make.
Yeah, good. Well, we haven't got any questions just yet, but I've got another one that's a really rather more general point. I'm not quite sure how to phrase this, but I'm thinking about this sort of psychology behind what you've been talking about, and Chris and I have been doing some work on this separate as well. And what in essence we're talking about is moving away from a rather negative psychology of over criticism and so forth, and perhaps more in the sort of bottom southwest corner, if you like, of the model, and moving to more towards the north, which is much more a sort of positive, reinforcing, supporting, positive psychology of the conversation. And so one of the reflections that we've had is actually a lot of the methodologies for improvement. So take Lean or Six Sigma or some of these things. The whole language is much too negative in its perspective. So you take Lean, for example, it's about problems. In other words, it's we're doing something wrong. It's about waste. We're doing something wrong. It's not even opportunities, it's problems. I mean, opportunities might be sort of neutral, but it's not a positive. It's not a, we're doing a fantastic job. If we could go a bit further and do this as well, which is exactly what you were saying in your language in that conversation. But that whole emphasis in lean, it's a sort of downbeat, negative, conversation that we're having. So I suppose it's a wider context than you're talking about here. But I wonder what your thoughts on that would be.
I think you're really onto something, Peter. I think that is characteristic of that field. I don't quite know why specifically, in the lean era. It may be that a lot of the original thinking was done, as you know better than I do, a very long time ago now. As far back as the 1940s, 1950s, and maybe there's something of that cultural theme coming through. I think there's a general critique of psychology also, which is that historically being based on clinical illness, and the rise of positive psychology has been the reaction to that. Yes, looking at what works well rather than what fails. So I think that the language we use is critical to adoption, and critical, and I keep coming back to this point, to discretionary effort, because we all know that somebody might say something pretty punchy towards us and that has an effect on us immediately. But the more subtle thing is about the drip, drip, drip of conversation. It's about when I'm hearing 100 times a day, well, we have a problem to face. There is this problem, there is that problem, there is this problem here. We're no longer thinking about the word that's being used and stepping up and saying, actually, that's not really helpful to me to hear this language all the time. But the drip, drip is it's having a continuous negative effect.
That's right. Because I'm hearing the word problem, 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 rather than what the problem was and what do I need to do about it.
Exactly right. And so words have a huge impact on how we feel, but not in an immediately conscious level, unless we're raising our consciousness, unless we're saying, what, I'm going to listen very carefully to what's being said here, and I'm consciously going to reframe the language in a way that it's going to be heard differently or better.
Yeah.
So my response, it's a huge subject area. We should probably talk about it more, but I think you're definitely on to something. My final point would be that I think it is a mistake to swing from an observation that a lot of this language is negative and therefore everything should be positive. The real world requires a balance. Sometimes it is necessary to use language which is critical, because circumstances are demanding that it is. So what we need is a good range and balance. I know the moment when I shift the construction of language to something which is more positive, and also recognize there are some occasions where I even might need to be quite brutal on something, because it's so critical, or it's risking somebody's health and safety or something of that sort. So I would aim for a balance, but I think the shift is not a trivial one. I think the shift from where we are generally to the point where we can be overwhelmingly more positive and more inquiring is actually quite a big leap for organizations to take.
I mean, looking at the positive and negative psychology, drawing on some of the sort of educational psychology, which quite a lot is based on child learning and so forth. Coming out of that, it would appear that somewhere in the sort of 3 to 4 to 1 is the right ratio of positive to more corrective. And if we say corrective, we could actually use the word opportunity based to make it more neutral rather than negative. Whereas my experience in business is often 4 to 1, but the other way around. It's more corrective conversations rather than positive conversations. You think of PDP conversations, they're often more of this is what you're not doing well, rather than this is what you are doing well, and could you do more of this type of conversation.
And it's interesting.
But also the day-to-day conversations people have tend to be focused more on correction than acknowledgement of good work.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. We have a question coming in, so I'm gonna just have a look at this one. So there's one from Simon here. How did the team feel about the phrase wouldn't it be great if, as the, I think it must be key phrase to set a positive sense of direction of travel for the lean journey and the improvements?
Wouldn't it be great if,
and then ...
Okay, would you like me to respond to that?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So I think two responses to Simon on that one. The first is definitely a step up from, hey, we've got an awful problem here, what do we do about it? If I contrast it with the most recent part of the conversation we've had. So I think it's definitely a much more positive thing that is likely to engage people more fully. My reservation about it would be, it depends on what then follows, because the wouldn't it be great could be a question, could be a leading question, and that's fine if you want to lead people, but it's not fine if you're wanting people to think for themselves. So if it were something, wouldn't it be great if we could create an environment where we increase productivity by 20%?
There's actually, let me just interrupt you there, Kev. Simon's put, e.g., wouldn't it be great if we can deliver next day to our customer, as an example?
Okay.
Which sounds quite positive.
It sounds quite positive, and I'm not going to say this is a wrong thing to do. What I'm saying is be mindful of what you're doing. Are you saying to the team of people, we really need to start delivering next day delivery? In other words, is it really a question and it's open for people to say no to, or is it really a statement of intent? And if it's a statement of intent, it might be framed along the lines of, look, I think we've got some important challenges, one of which is to get next day delivery. Question I have is, how can we achieve that in a way that makes us X, Y, and Z?
I think
to me that would sound like a good way to phrase it, because then the sort of what do we need to achieve is coming from the leader, because that's the strategy, etc. But actually giving the autonomy to people to actually give their contribution and their ideas, and for the leader to listen and shape and so forth. Anyway, Chris, your
no, it's a great example of how we say the words are as important as the words themselves. So many phrases can come across as statements of fact, even when we intend them as questions. So Kevin talks a lot about the tone of the voice that we use and the way that we express ourselves when we make those statements. So it's never, occasionally see people create a question or create a statement which they then try and deploy across the organization, but actually everyone who then repeats it says it in a different way. So you can't just use the words. You've got to think deeply about how we're going to use it.
I think that's right. I think Chris is right on that. And one of the things that helps with that is being clear about what the intention is behind the voice that's being used. So if everybody can inquire, everybody can ask an open question, and we can do it with very different levels of tonality. But the real purpose behind inquiry is about connection with others. It's about being curious and interested in the other person. Now, if I engage in a state of curiosity and I then inquire, we've got a really nice combination of factors. But if my state of mind is one in which I'm cynical and I then inquire, then actually what's heard is something different. And so we've got one also has to come back to the understanding, what's the intention behind me using this voice? And there's got to be an alignment between the intention and the way in which the question or the statement ends up being voiced.
Mm-hmm. So I think it's language, it's as you say, it's tone as well. The tone of how you ask a question could give a quite different meaning to it being a question or a statement or shouting at someone. I mean, the other thing is the sort of body language that they give. If they're sitting there back in their chair and they're rolling their eyes with their arms crossed when they're saying something, and is it really sincere? I mean, how many times have we heard Americans say "Have a nice day," and do they actually mean that or not? I don't know. you know, but you know, that whole body language stuff is key as well.
I think it's really the whole issue is about being conscious about the combination of those things. So that gesturing, the facial expression, if this is false, we will pick up on it really quickly. You know, we can spot the smooth talking bar steward very, very quickly. Yeah, saying all the right words, but you know, where's the authenticity behind this? And people are quite good at picking up, as you said, Peter, on when what is being said is at variance with what seems truly to be being said. I mean, we are meaning-making mammals. You know, we pick up on all sorts of cues, and we do have to attend to the whole thing. But in so doing, I think becoming more conscious and more skilled of the way we use the words itself is an important part of that internal improvement process.
Yeah.
The more conscious we are of how we're speaking or what we're saying, the more actually we can give some attention and control to how we're presenting ourselves physically.
Yeah, I'm sort of thinking about the you know, what you're saying and the language and these other things like the tone and the body language and this sort of thing. I'm thinking of different types of communication. So, I mean, a lot of companies, a lot of the communication is emails. And as we all know, you can quite misunderstood what is said in an email, even if the language is quite clear, whether or not it's done in a positive tone or a negative tone. You've no idea. And I've been doing quite a lot of work in VR, and to some degree you can tell in VR because people are saying it, but you miss the body language and what the eyes are telling you, etc. And then obviously if you're doing it face to face, you get a much richer what's really being said and how it's being said if you have these different media. And I was thinking about, you know, as the workforce is increasingly at home and having remote conversations, we need to be even clearer about this sort of more positive inquiry-based approach. For instance, you know, a lot of people at home suffering mentally, not seeing colleagues and this sort of thing, and they need increasingly this type of support and questioning and, you know, coaching and this type of thing at the same time.
Yeah, it's true. And I've noticed increasingly, I don't know whether you've seen this, I've noticed increasingly people, when they're sending emails to each other, explaining their intention behind the email before they send the email.
Yeah.
So they'll say things like, I want to write to you about this because, and I'd like you to read what I say with, you know, the following frame of mind. For precisely those reasons that you can't quite tell what's behind the written word without everything else going on. And people are also sensitive to the risk of being misinterpreted. Because actually, when you and I are talking now, and it's particularly if this were face to face, the potential for misinterpretation is real and live in every moment. But we can auto-correct as we speak. You can't do that with a written word.
Yeah.
We don't have that facility available to us.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Good. So I know we're not having a lot of questions, but Chris, do you want to just say a few more words about some of the other things that are in the book that might be quite interesting to hear about?
Sure. One of the key focuses in the book is on behaviours, because we firmly believe that if we really want to get the best out of an assessment system, then really got to start thinking about how we maturing behaviours through the different levels of NIM maturity or CI maturity. And so we talk about how to assess behaviours, how to define behaviours, how to assess behaviours, how to measure them through key behavioural indicators. So there's a lot of examples on that. And we also have case studies from, Peter's written a whole chapter, a case study from an electronics business on key behavioural indicators. And we have case studies from food production, from financial services. And we have a case study, for example, where one organisation has changed the whole way that they recruit to be behaviourally focused. So they've gone through a journey and decided that actually key to success is the way that people behave. And they've clearly defined those behaviours, they've got KPIs in place, and now that they've actually built those into the recruitment process, so the behaviours are the priority for selection. And they were able to recruit almost an entire team based on behaviours. and they've seen that behavior is taking precedence over skills, for example, our experience, and they've been able to see that team have progressed rapidly through maturity and performance faster than any other team. So there's quite a lot of evidence that behavioral focus works and gives great results.
Very good, thank you. I think what we might do is wrap things up there, guys. So thank you very much for Chris, the overview, and Kevin, the deep dive there. So very good. So I'm going to hand over to Emma to just wrap us up for the day.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much, Kevin and Chris, for a great presentation. So yes, thank you for joining, and you will receive a feedback email from myself. And if you have any further questions for Chris and Kevin, or details on the book, then please email myself and I can forward those across to Kevin and Chris. And we hope to see you again soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much, guys.
Okay.
Bye now. Bye.
Thanks, Kevin.